Okay, I think we have a pretty good mass of people on. So thank you again for joining us. My name is Isabel Gamara. I'm the Director of Communications and Advocacy of Groundwork. We're the host of this webinar. Many of you probably know Duke, but he's not able to join us today, so I'm playing the pseudo replacement today. Just for those who don't know a little bit about us, we are a housing focused nonprofit here in Benton, Washington counties in Northwest Arkansas. We really we were founded in 2021, and for the past almost 3 years, we've been working to lay the foundation for housing accessibility in the region. We are incubated under the Northwest Arkansas Council with support from the Family Foundation, and we are focused on two main areas, well, three really. One is facilitating collaboration among partners and our cities on how we can bring more housing to the market. The second is we will be launching a housing fund that invests in workforce housing. And the third is communications and advocacy. So this is really where this webinar comes in. Every year we host a variety of different speakers and bring top experts from around the nation to speak to our local community about best practices from around the United States and how we can implement them here locally. So we hope that this serves as a little bit of inspiration for you as we continue to search for solutions for our housing accessibility issues. Before we begin, I wanted to give two housekeeping notes. One is we will be taking a Q&A at the end. So if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A box at the bottom of the webinar. If you really want to ask for them in person, please go ahead and raise your hand and we'll go ahead and let you ask you that at the end of after Gregg's presentation. And then the second is we will also be sending out a survey at the end of the session. If you could please take the survey, your feedback is very valuable to us as we continue to curate more of these sessions. And finally, I did want to give a special shout out to New Beginnings, Continuum of Care, and all of our other partners who have joined us today. We're so thank you, Seven Hills, so thankful for their partnership and helping us disseminate this important webinar. And obviously, thank you to Gregg for joining us. So today we have the privilege to be joined by Solomon Birchfield. He's the program director of New Beginnings, and he'll be serving as your official MC. Solomon, go ahead and take it away.
Thank you so much, Isabel, and thank you to Groundwork for hosting this crucial conversation about housing and homelessness. I'm really excited to hear from Gregg. His presentation, I've read his book, and his presentation is going to be very enlightening. So just to introduce myself, my name is Solomon Birchfield. I am the executive director at New Beginnings in WA. We build housing and grow community with people who are recovering from chronic homelessness. So before I turn things over to Gregg for his presentation on how homelessness is a housing problem, I do want to take 5 or 6, 8 minutes to kind of set the table for us here in Northwest Arkansas regarding homelessness. So in January of 2024, volunteers in Northwest Arkansas counted 412 people experiencing literal homelessness. And that means people who are staying in an emergency shelter, camping in the woods, sleeping in their car, or in some other place that's not meant for human habitation. And when you add to this number of 412, the additional people that the survey just didn't catch, we know that 412 on that night in January, we didn't catch everybody. And when you add to that number, people who were not homeless that night, but are probably homeless on a different night in Northwest Arkansas throughout the year of 2024. And then when you add to that the 2,700 students who our school districts report throughout the year are young people staying in hotels, doubled up on couches in Northwest Arkansas, we see that the real estimate for homelessness is in the thousands. When you look historically at these annual counts, how many people experience homelessness, sadly, the number is going up, not down. And All of this in the context of a housing market in Northwest Arkansas where the average apartment rent has gone up by nearly 50% in the last 5 years. That's why we really do call this a crisis, an affordable housing and homelessness crisis. I like to think of the people who are impacted by the affordable housing and homelessness crisis in three overlapping groups. So, in the first group, think about the tens of thousands of Northwest Arkansas renters who are paying rents they cannot afford. These are families who pay more than 30% of their monthly income towards housing. It includes 16,000 households where they're paying more than 50% of their monthly income on housing. These are families that have to cut back on essential needs. They rely on food pantries and free health clinics and back to school drives just to be able to meet their basic needs while they struggle to stay precariously in housing they really can't afford. When you talk to people in this circumstance, they often say, "Hey, how are we supposed to live when the costs of housing keep going up and up and up, and the wages that our household earns do not keep pace?" That's the first group, and it's thousands, tens of thousands of our neighbors here in Northwest Arkansas. The second group includes people who at one time were likely in that first group, people living in homes they could barely afford, trying to keep up when life threw them a curveball. Some of these people have lost their home because of a job loss or a relationship change or a health event. Maybe they've been down this road before and they've run out of families and friends that would let them double up. And so a mom ends up sleeping in her car with two kids. Or a man who's looking for work stays in an emergency shelter for a few months trying to get his feet back under him. Living this way is really dangerous. Living on the streets, it affects people's health and mental health. So this second group of people is who's included in the count that we do each year, and that's this 412 number that I referenced at the beginning. The third group I'll call your attention to is a subpopulation within that group of 412. These are people who've been living on the streets or in shelters many years. People who experience long-term, recurring homelessness face circumstances that make them unique from some of the other people going through an episode of homelessness. Chronically homeless people are more likely to have complex health conditions. They're more likely to have faced early childhood trauma. They're more likely to experience a substance use disorder or a serious mental illness. Often it's multiple ones of these challenges that they face at once. Chronically homeless people tend to cycle through emergency rooms and local jails, shelters, and the street year after year after year. It may only be 150 people or so, about 30% of our homeless count, but they utilize a disproportionate amount of the services offered in the homeless response system, not to mention incurring disproportionately high costs on public sector systems like jails, like hospitals. Our community spends an awful lot of money to not end chronic homelessness in Northwest Arkansas. That's the piece that New Beginnings focuses on in our area. We build housing and grow community with people who are recovering from chronic homelessness. We have a bridge housing community in South Fayetteville where there's 20 individual cabins and a community building. The community is actually run by the people who are recovering from homelessness. And we have staff who are on site 24/7. At New Beginnings, we host a Place to Heal, which is Arkansas's first medical respite for the homeless project. We have a nurse who coordinates closely with the Washington Regional Medical Center to provide shelter and healthcare support for unhoused people who are well enough to discharge from the hospital but are too sick to recover on the street. And our newest project that we're in the process of creating is a pocket neighborhood with help from a grant from the city of Fayetteville, where we are developing duplexes that will provide extremely affordable rent with ongoing support services so that people with disabilities and long-term homeless backgrounds can stabilize and thrive. New Beginnings works with so many partners, like the Salvation Army, Seven Hills Homeless Center, the Way Station. All of these area providers collaborate through something called the Continuum of Care, or the COC. The Continuum of Care organizes the regional response to address homelessness. And that is the way that Northwest Arkansas can keep track of the value and the dignity of each person in our community by making homelessness rare, brief, and non-recurring. We know that affordable housing is the issue that connects everyone in our community, whether it's people in the workforce who need affordable housing, all the way down to people at the bottom who have been on the streets for many years. We all need a community abundant with homes that fit people's needs. And that is why it is my pleasure today to be able to introduce our presenter, Gregg Colburn, whose book, Homelessness is a Housing Problem, has made a big impact on me. Gregg Colburn is an associate professor in the Runstad Department of Real Estate in the College of Built Environments at the University of Washington. He publishes research on topics related to housing and homelessness and is the co-author of the book, Homelessness is a Housing Problem: How Structural Factors Explain U.S. Patterns. His research has been featured in leading media outlets, including The Atlantic, The New York Times, The Economist, Bloomberg, and the National Public Radio. So, Gregg, we are so happy to welcome you to Northwest Arkansas, and we are excited to listen and learn from your presentation today.
Thank you, Solomon. I really appreciate the introduction and that framing. I think it's really good framing for what I'm going to spend some time talking about here. And Isabel, thank you for the introduction and the opportunity to present to your community. I am going to share my slides here, and hopefully this works. Are you seeing that okay, Solomon?
Yes.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to speak for about a half hour or so, and then I look forward to your comments and questions. I have had a chance to deliver this this talk all around the country and internationally as well, and it's really been interesting to see how homelessness is impacting so many communities throughout the United States. Certainly, the problem is most acute in places like my hometown of Seattle. But it's no longer just become an issue of Seattle and LA and New York and Boston. It's creeping into every community in the country. So that's obviously a huge concern, and particularly for the people who are experiencing homelessness or at risk of homelessness, the groups that Solomon just described. But I will say there's a benefit in that in the sense that it raises awareness. And the more that awareness is raised, the more likely it is that we're going to make the investments and pursue the strategies that we know are solutions to this problem. So it's a double-edged sword. I wish that we weren't in this crisis situation, but the crisis creates opportunity, and we need to make sure that we take advantage of that opportunity. So this is the book. We wrote this book. It was published in 2022. I moved to Seattle in 2017. To begin my work at the University of Washington. I had a first career in finance. I was an investment banker and private equity investor. And so I was raised in the markets, professionally speaking. And so you'll certainly see and hear some of that perspective in my talk today. And so when I got to Seattle, my motivation for writing this book was an observation that we as a community didn't really understand what was going on, what was driving this crisis. There was broad agreement that there was a crisis of homelessness and housing affordability in Seattle, that it's hard to miss that. But what was not clear was what was driving this. And so there were all these competing narratives about the cause of the crisis, and even well-intentioned people who are reading the Seattle Times every day are understandably confused because we attribute this crisis to so many different factors. So what I wanted to do with this book was hopefully translate what we've known in the academic literature for some time in a book that was accessible to a general reader. I didn't write this book for other professors to read. I wrote this book for someone who's walking around in Seattle saying, why is the problem of homelessness so bad here and not other places I've been? And so I've been pleased that people have actually read the book. It's funny, I haven't written a book before, and so I wasn't sure if anyone would read it. I knew my parents would, and that might have been it, but they did read it, but so did other people. And so that's been really rewarding. And So I've had a chance to visit lots of communities around the United States. Actually just recently got back from a 10-day tour in Australia where I spoke in Melbourne and Sydney and Brisbane about the homelessness challenges in their communities. And what you'll see from this list is it's not just the usual suspects. I certainly have been to the big cities on the coast, but I've been to a lot of smaller communities, not unlike yours, that are experiencing growth and prosperity, which are wonderful. But that growth and prosperity also has a consequence, which is there are some people being left behind because they can no longer afford the housing that is becoming increasingly unaffordable in many communities like Northwest Arkansas. And so I'm pleased to have the opportunity to talk about this. So one of the central challenges when we think about homelessness is dealing with the issue of causation. And as a social scientist, I have my PhD in public policy. You know, in graduate school, we teach all these courses about causation. And causation in the social world is difficult because human beings are complex. And so when we talk about causation and homelessness, one is it's complicated. I've never experienced homelessness or housing precarity, but I've talked to a lot of people who have. Obviously, Solomon does this every day, and I'm sure he would agree that every story is unique and tragic. So I'm not going to stand up here and say this is the one cause of homelessness, because that would be disingenuous. And there's also one of the challenges we have is there are causes at the individual level, and then there are causes at the community level. And that can complicate the story on homelessness. And so one of the ways that we know about homelessness is we ask the people. We ask people who are experiencing homelessness or have previously experienced homelessness, why are you homeless? And when we ask that question, we get very blunt and honest answers. Some people will attribute it to job loss or domestic violence or relational breakdown or poor decisions, or I drink too much, or I got in a fight with my roommate and she kicked me out. So we need to honor these explanations because they're the truth and the experiences of these individuals. So one of the central challenges I had when thinking about this book, when I was just kind of framing it in my mind, was I knew that I was going to be centering housing in this conversation. But I also knew that there might be a woman standing next to me saying, the reason I'm homeless is because of domestic violence. My boyfriend beat me up. And so what I wanted to do was be able to honor both the individual explanations that people tell us, which is their truth, with the structural drivers of homelessness that the academic literature has demonstrated for us are true causal drivers. So to reconcile that, these two kind of competing narratives is one, not to have them compete. It's rather to understand that precipitating events, such as domestic violence or addiction or job loss, layer on top of structure or root causes of homelessness. And that helps us then understand the full complexity of this really complex phenomenon. The way that we highlight the difference between a root cause and precipitating event in the book is this metaphor of musical chairs. So imagine some friends come together to play a game of musical chairs. There are 10 friends. They put 10 chairs in a circle. A leader begins the game by turning on music, and then these 10 friends start to walk around in a circle. At some point, a leader pulls one chair out. We're now down to 9 chairs. And when the leader stops the music, everyone scrambles for a chair, and by definition, someone loses. In this case, the loser was Mike, who was on crutches after spraining his ankle. And so he was unable to move quickly when the scramble ensued, and of course lost the game. And so if we asked Mike after the game, what caused you to lose the game? Keep in mind, this is the word we're using, cause. He would say he had a bad ankle. And most people would agree, yes, if Mike hadn't had a bad ankle, he wouldn't have lost the game. But if we ask a different question and say, why didn't Mike have a chair? The answer to that question is because we didn't have 10 chairs. The reason why Mike was chairless depends on the question that you ask. It's either because of his ankle or the fact that we don't have enough chairs. So this is, I would argue, the exact thing that's happening in Seattle and San Francisco and Los Angeles right now, which is when we have a structural deficit of housing, when we don't have enough chairs, who's going to lose the game? The people who lose the game are people who are vulnerable in some way, shape, or form. They're poor, they're addicted, they're physically disabled, they have a mental health condition, they've been discriminated against, whatever the issue. And they end up finding themselves on the street. And then we walk by these individuals and we're all guilty of this. And we say, well, of course, Joe's homeless, he's addicted. Of course, Mike lost the game, he had a bad ankle. And in that simple analysis, what we're missing is the fact that we don't have sufficient housing. And therefore, that deficit of housing created the conditions for someone to end up losing. And that person is Mike, who is suffering with an addiction right now. And so these individual interactions that we have in cities like Seattle help to cement the idea that this is a condition that is driven by individual vulnerability as opposed to a structural deficit of housing. So the purpose of the book is not to dismiss issues related to addiction, mental illness, poverty, et cetera. They're all important. They deserve attention and treatment, but to center the deficit of housing that's creating the conditions that allow for homelessness to flourish in our communities. So I don't want you to leave and say that Gregg doesn't think drug use is a problem. Of course it is. Of course it is. We know that if you're addicted or mentally ill or poor, you're more likely to experience homelessness. That's an individual cause of homelessness. But we also know that those conditions produce homelessness in some contexts and not others. So we should want to understand why that is and what's going on. So the organizing question of the book is, why do rates of homelessness vary so widely throughout the United States? The sample in our book is about the 30 largest metro areas in the United States, and there's huge variation across those cities. Why does, on a per capita basis, San Francisco have 5 times the per capita homelessness of Chicago? Is it simply because there are more people with vulnerabilities in San Francisco and Seattle and Los Angeles? Or is there something else going on? It turns out it's not just the mere prevalence of people with these conditions in those cities. The housing market plays a really important role. So this is a book about cities, not about people. This doesn't mean that person-focused research isn't important. The purpose of this book is to understand what is going on in Seattle. Why is the problem so bad here and it's not in Chicago? And our thesis is that tight housing markets accentuate vulnerabilities and then produce homelessness at much higher levels in places with those market conditions. And these individual vulnerabilities, which are important and receive a lot of attention on social media and in the newspaper, they really are a sorting mechanism. They help to identify the people who are most likely to experience homelessness when housing is scarce. So to give you a sense of this variation, since that's what we're trying to explain in the book, here is a list of all the cities in our sample, metropolitan areas. Northwest Arkansas is not included in the list. It wasn't quite large enough, but I do think the logic still holds in mid-sized communities like yours. There's a bureaucratic nuance here at play, which is some places count at the city level and some count homelessness at the county level. Neither way is right or wrong, but there are implications for per capita rates. Per capita rates of homelessness tend to be higher in cities because homelessness tends to congregate in the urban core. Counties, because you're including suburban locations there, will tend to have lower per capita rates of homelessness, all else equal. So we need to compare cities to cities and counties to counties. We can't compare 2 different types of jurisdictions to each other. And so when you group all the cities in our sample, what you'll see is New York, Washington, D.C., San Francisco, and Boston have about 10, between 9 and 10 homeless individuals per 1,000 people on a per capita basis. And that's about 5 times what Chicago and Indianapolis have, which are right around 2. When you move to counties, the numbers are lower because of the suburban phenomenon that I mentioned earlier. But what's really interesting, and I didn't realize this until I ran these numbers, is the relationship is also 5 to 1. So LA County, Santa Clara County, King County, which is Seattle, and Multnomah, which is Portland, have about 5 per capita. And Hillsborough County, which is Tampa, they obviously had a very rough day yesterday. Thinking about them, they're at about 1 per capita. So what we're trying to explain in the book is, why do we have this huge variation? If we can answer that question, it should tell us something fundamental about the nature of this crisis. And I can say from experience, here in Seattle, housing might not take us to 0, but if we can get to and look more like Chicago or Indianapolis or Detroit in terms of homelessness, that would be a big win, right? And we would argue that getting there will require a lot more housing and a lot more affordable housing. So the logic of the book is we're going to take a bunch of explanations and use really simple statistics to see if it helps us understand regional variation. If it doesn't help us understand regional variation, we cross it off and we move to the next one until we find explanations that provide a credible answer to the question of why homelessness is higher in some places than others. So we're going to start with poverty, which is obviously probably the most fundamental driver of homelessness. Poverty or homelessness, of course, is a poverty problem. If you're poor, you're more likely to experience homelessness. So what's interesting, though, is when you plot rates of poverty against rates of homelessness, and just to orient you, the numbers on the bottom of this graph are the poverty rate, in this case, the percentage of people who are below the federal poverty line. And then the y-axis or the vertical axis is rates of homelessness per 1,000 people. So obviously, the higher the number, the higher the per capita rate of homelessness. So when you plot rates of homelessness against rates of poverty, what you'll see is there's a downward relationship, which means that in places with higher poverty, they tend to have lower rates of homelessness. which is a head scratcher because we all know that poverty causes homelessness. So how do we interpret this? The way that we interpret this is, for example, Detroit, Michigan is the most impoverished city in the big city in the United States. Very, very high poverty rates. And Detroit has far lower rates of homelessness than really affluent cities like Seattle and San Francisco. So this doesn't mean that poverty doesn't matter. What this means is being poor in an affluent place has different consequences than being poor in a more impoverished location. Okay? Seattle doesn't have a homelessness problem because we have more per capita, more percentage of our population that's poor. We actually have far fewer poor people on a per capita basis than a lot of other places, but we have a lot of homelessness. And so the consequences of being poor in Seattle are very different. That's the point of this slide. So we can't blame disproportionate rates of poverty for the homelessness crisis on the West and East Coast. We have to keep looking for a better answer. This is rates of serious mental illness. This data is at the state level. The data on drug use and mental illness are better at the state level than at the city level. And so we use this data. So it's every state in the nation plotted against the rates of homelessness and rates of serious mental illness. And what you'll see is there's basically no statistical relationship between the two. There are people experiencing serious mental illness in every state in the nation at varying rates, and that variation has almost no explanatory power for rates of homelessness. We don't see more homelessness in places with high rates of serious mental illness. Similar story here with rates of substance use disorder. R squared of 0.06 is largely a non-finding. There are people abusing drugs in every state in the nation, and it has very, very little relationship to overall rates of homelessness. And so some people get frustrated with this finding because they really have linked mental illness and drug use to the crisis of homelessness in the United States. Certainly there are individual risk factors, there's no doubt about that. But people will say to me, Greg, this is obviously a drug problem. And my response to that is, well, do you think people use drugs in Chicago? And of course, the answer to that question is yes. And then we think about a state like West Virginia, which has been the home of the opioid epidemic in the United States. At least last time I checked, they had the highest overdose death rate in the United States. Really, really tragic. But what's interesting is one of the consequences of that drug crisis has not been a huge crisis of homelessness. If this were fundamentally driven by drugs, we should see a lot more homelessness in the Southeast, in Tennessee and Louisiana and West Virginia, places with relatively high drug use, but not high rates of homelessness. The other thing that's important in this behavioral health discussion is we know that drug use and mental illness can cause homelessness. We also know that drug use and mental illness can be a consequence of experiencing homelessness. It's very, very traumatic to experience homelessness. And so we know that people develop behavioral health disorders as a result of that experience. And so if you want to end the behavioral health crisis in Seattle, the best thing we can do is not leave people on the street for years on end. The behavioral health crisis, we are pouring gasoline on this fire. We are exacerbating the behavioral health crisis by not housing people. And so we fundamentally need to think about how to get more people in housing such that we don't exacerbate these really troubling behavioral health challenges. Finally, Black, Brown, Indigenous people are grossly overrepresented in the homeless population in the United States. But what's interesting is race, or the racial composition of a city, doesn't help us understand homelessness, meaning cities with a higher Black population don't have more homelessness, even though Black people are overrepresented in the homeless population. So how do we make sense of that finding that seems somewhat contradictory? Well, the way I describe it is that race doesn't cause homelessness. Being Black doesn't cause homelessness. If it did, Chicago should have lots more homelessness than Seattle. Seattle is a disproportionately white city, while Chicago has a much higher Black population. But Chicago has far lower rates of homelessness. So the point of this slide is that race doesn't cause homelessness, but racism does. Racism helps to explain why Black people are overrepresented in the homeless population in both Chicago and Seattle and New York City and Jackson, Mississippi, and all over the United States. Okay. Racism and discrimination helps to identify the people who are more likely to experience homelessness when housing is scarce. That's the story here. So none of these individual explanations do a very good job of explaining regional variation, of providing a credible answer to the question we pose in the book. So we've had to cross off all of these explanations, and we're going to continue on now to the next category, which is local contextual factors. I joke that this is kind of the cocktail party conversation about homelessness that I hear all the time. Housing and homelessness is interesting because everyone seems to have an opinion about it. My best friend has a PhD in physics, so when people hear that, they just kind of shut down and don't say anything. When people hear that I study homelessness, they are very excited and quick to tell me what's going on here. And so I just sit and smile and listen, usually with a glass of red wine in my hand. As people tell me things like, well, Greg, the reason why LA has lots of homelessness is it's warm there. And the reason Chicago doesn't have homelessness is because it's cold in Chicago. And those are true statements, because we count homelessness in January. So those are two very true statements about the weather. But there are also warm locations in Arizona and Texas and Florida that don't have the same experience with homelessness that LA does. And there are cold locations like Boston and New York that have very, very high rates of homelessness. So this simple blaming of Mother Nature makes sense when we're comparing LA and Chicago, but when you zoom out to the United States, what you'll see is there's not much of a statistical relationship at all between rates of homelessness and the weather in January when we count homelessness. So we can't blame Mother Nature, as tempting as that is. We have to keep looking for a better explanation. The next explanation is one that I hear a lot, which is, Greg, if we weren't so generous in Seattle, if we didn't provide generous social services, people would stop moving to Seattle to experience homelessness. In other words, by being generous, we're creating the crisis of homelessness. And therefore, as the logic would follow, if we stop being generous, if we stop providing benefits, we would not have a problem with homelessness. Therefore, let's end these benefits. The problem with that analysis is that every community in the United States feels like they're a magnet for homelessness. I've heard this all over the place, and it's not true. It's not true, as tempting as it is. People are not relocating around the United States to find slightly better benefits. Okay. This is TANF, the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, which is one of the primary federal welfare programs. TANF this program has been devolved to states, meaning that states get to determine the generosity of the program. So we have stingy states, we have generous states. And we can actually test and see, are people locating in generous states at disproportionate rates? Meaning, is the welfare magnet occurring for homelessness? And what we see is that there's no statistical relationship. Why do we think that is? The reason we don't see it is because moving is hard. It's challenging. It takes resources. In the best of circumstances, moving is hard. And now imagine you have nothing. You're at the end of the rope. You don't have any resources. Are you going to move across the country for some slightly more generous benefits? The answer to that question is no. We know that social networks are important to all of us. If you have very limited resources, those social networks are absolutely essential. And so are you going to leave Seattle if your mom is there and she can take care of your kids when you're working, and you're going to move to Kansas because it's cheaper? No chance. No chance. We know from research in California that was just released, 90% of the people experiencing homelessness in California are from California. So this is a homegrown problem. Are there anecdotes to the contrary? Of course there are. There is in every circumstance, but we shouldn't legislate. We shouldn't make policy based on these anecdotes, right? We should look at the data and see that this is a homegrown problem. We've created the conditions in many of our coastal cities for homelessness to flourish. And rather than blaming people who are moving in, we should look in the mirror and say, well, then what are we going to do to change it? We created these conditions. We can change those conditions. Finally, politics. There have been some well-documented fights between, for example, President Trump and Governor Gavin Newsom of California. Trump blaming Democrats in West Coast cities for homelessness, Gavin Newsom firing back and blaming the federal government for a lack of investment in affordable housing. So it's important to kind of think about local politics in homelessness. It is very true that Democrats run Seattle, San Francisco, and Los Angeles, and it's also very true that those cities have high rates of homelessness. And so it's easy then to attribute and say, well, then Democratic leadership is a problem. What that simple analysis ignores is the fact that Democrats also run St. Louis and Detroit and Cleveland and Chicago and have for as long as I've been alive. So the simple analysis of Democratic local leadership probably doesn't hold up because generally speaking, Democrats run cities in the United States. There are a couple of exceptions, Indianapolis, Miami, San Diego, but generally speaking, Democrats run cities. This doesn't mean that Democrats get a pass. In fact, there are a lot of leaders in West Coast cities where when we start to think about housing production, the Democrats have not done a very good job of creating the housing capacity that we need. So they don't get a free pass, but the simple analysis of permissive left-leaning mayors causing this crisis doesn't really hold up because there have been plenty of Democratic mayors that have not created a homelessness crisis. So none of these local context factors do a very good job of explaining the regional variation, which is the core question that we're trying to provide a credible answer to. So we now move to the final category here, which is housing market explanations. And this is where we start to see a much more a significant relationship between predictive factors and rates of homelessness. Okay, so here what we see is this is median contract rents in every city in our sample plotted against rates of homelessness. And what you'll see is a more significant statistical relationship. Where rents are high, homelessness is high. This is not groundbreaking research. It's relatively intuitive, but the data shows a pretty compelling relationship here. And the relationship is far more convincing than it is with the other variables that we look at in the book. A related variable is rental market vacancy rate. What you'll see is when rental market vacancy rates get below 5%, which is kind of a threshold marker of a market that's in equilibrium between supply and demand. When you get below 5%, it would suggest that you have a deficit of rental housing. And what you'll see here is that when vacancy rates get low, when they get below 5%, homelessness tends to be much higher. And so when you think about rents and vacancy rates, which have a causal relationship between them, obviously lower vacancy rates lead to higher rents. When you put those two things together, it's not a perfect predictor, but it's a pretty good predictor for the problem of homelessness. There's really not a counterexample of a place in the United States with high rents and low vacancies that doesn't have a problem with homelessness. Every single one of them does. And so ultimately, if we want our big coastal cities with high rates of homelessness to have less homelessness, we probably need to have more vacancies and lower rents. Otherwise, we're going to continue to struggle with homelessness. Because as Solomon mentioned earlier, there are all these people who are precariously housed in these markets because housing is very tough to get. And all it takes is one health emergency, one kid to get sick, a car to break down, a job loss, and then we go from stably housed to homeless relatively quickly. And that's why the problem is so significant in places where housing is really expensive and scarce. And so when we think about why do certain locations in the country have these characteristics, is it just because people are moving there? And I know a lot of people have moved to your community as your economy thrives, and that's great. Prosperity is wonderful. Is it simply this moving dynamic that's creating the problem? The answer to that question is no, and this surprised me a little bit. There's almost no statistical relationship between population change and rates of homelessness. This surprised me so much. I reran these numbers 3 times because I thought I'd messed something up. What was interesting though is when I backed out and started to look at each of these bubbles and dots, what I realized is that there were places, especially in the southern United States, that were growing very rapidly, but were not having the same experience with housing and homelessness crisis because of their supply of housing. There's a notion in economics called supply elasticity, which is a really important measure. What it measures is how responsive is the housing supply to changes in price. Put another way, if prices of housing go up by a lot, is there a big supply response, meaning a lot more housing is built, or is a limited supply built? Okay. An elastic market would build a lot of housing when demand increases. An inelastic market would build far less housing when demand goes up. And we know from urban economists that there's big variation in rates in supply elasticity across cities. And the 2 drivers of that are topography and regulatory environment. If you have challenging topography, mountains and water, it's harder to build more housing. If you have a really strict regulatory environment, tough to get permitting, restrictive land use, et cetera, it's very hard to scale your housing production. Okay. If you combine challenging topography and strict regulation, as exists in San Francisco, what you're going to end up with is a really inelastic housing supply. And when you pair population growth, a wealth boom, with inelastic housing supply, you get a real big problem. And so when we plot these 2 factors, so just to orient you in terms of what you're looking at here, this is for the decade of the 2010s. The bottom axis is change in population, and I'd like you to think about that as a proxy for demand for housing. More people moving to your community will create more demand for housing. The y-axis, or the vertical axis, is housing supply elasticity. The higher that number, the more housing is built in that community for a given price change. Okay. And so what we do is plot a bunch of cities here, and we show in the parentheses what their rental market vacancy rates were during the decade of the 2010s. So the upper right-hand quadrant to me is really interesting. What it shows is there are Sunbelt cities that grew just as fast as Seattle, San Francisco, and Boston, but did not have the same experiences with the housing crisis because they built a lot of housing. They had a relatively elastic housing supply. They were able to maintain, even with rapid population growth, more healthy rental market vacancy rates. The lower right-hand quadrant of this figure is really the perfect storm for a housing and homelessness crisis. What you have is rapid population growth. You don't build enough housing, and what happens? You end up with really low vacancy rates, high rents, and that's a challenge for everyone who lives in that community, and particularly those who are living on the very edges. People who are precariously housed, who are just one episode or incident of bad luck away from experiencing homelessness. And so, while tragic, I mean, this whole crisis is terribly tragic. It's tragic, but this was entirely predictable. This was entirely predictable, especially here in Seattle. We watched San Francisco go through their tech boom probably 10 or 15 years before us, and we didn't learn our lesson. And now we've gone through the exact same tech boom with Microsoft and Amazon here in Seattle, and we've ended up with the exact same result, which is really, really unaffordable housing and a real problem with homelessness, unfortunately. And so my hope for your community, as you grow and prosper, you can learn the lessons of our coastal cities and hopefully not repeat the mistakes that we made. The key, and what we've not done a very good job in the United States is how do we then make sure that we create and sustain adequate, affordable housing while we grow and prosper. We have places where housing is really affordable, like Detroit and Cleveland, but that affordability was created through decline, right? Industrial decline over the last 50 years. You lose a third of your population, the housing doesn't go away, and you end up with high vacancy rates and low rents. That's not something any mayor wants to sign up for. What we need is mayors who can say, we still want to create housing abundance and housing access while we grow and prosper. That's what we should be shooting for in our cities and communities around the United States. So to wrap up here, our data ended in 2019. What have we learned since then? Obviously, the pandemic had all sorts of issues in society and impacts. It also messed up our data. Data collection was challenged during that time period, but what we know is homelessness didn't surge during COVID, which was good news. And part of that was because we had a lot of rental assistance that came from the federal government, and we had local and state action to prevent evictions. And as a result, we held relatively constant during COVID from a homelessness perspective. But now that those protections have been pulled back, what we saw in the 23 numbers nationally is homelessness went up quite a bit. And I suspect that we're going to see the same thing when the 24 numbers are released in December this year. So what do we know? Do the post-19 data confirm the findings of the book? The answer is yes, and unfortunately, yes. And it confirms the findings for our coastal cities, but it's also confirming the findings in more communities. Places like Phoenix and Austin and Sacramento and Atlanta and Denver are now starting to have housing market dynamics that look a lot more like coastal cities, and they're starting to see a commensurate increase in homelessness. So unfortunately, the logic holds, and it's holding in more communities than it did when we initially wrote the book. One of the challenges now is, well, how are we going to respond if we have all this homelessness? There is a temptation, and the Supreme Court of the United States recently made it legal at the federal level to criminalize homelessness. We're seeing at the state level lots more action. Your neighbor and near neighbor in Oklahoma is attempting to pass a criminalization bill for homelessness in that state. The journalist who wrote this article apparently had read our book and asked this representative who was supporting this legislation, do you feel like homelessness is a housing problem? Representative Weaver said, well, it could be. I mean, it could be if they don't have any place to live. So Representative Weaver here is articulating and understanding that there is a housing problem here, even though he's also advocating for legislation that would make living outside a crime in the state of Oklahoma. So what about, what's going on in your community? I pulled up data for Washington County. What we see here is a pretty troubling trend. On the right side is your rental market vacancy rate. And what you'll see is, if you think about 5% being the neutral point here, you spent a lot of time below 5% over the last decade, which is a problem. And what you'll see is post-COVID, you're down in that 3 range, which has been like the Seattle, San Francisco, Boston range. That's a problem. Not surprisingly, what we're seeing is upward pressure on rental growth, especially this spike here that you see from 21 to 23. That is tied to these really low vacancy rates. And so when we think about rents that have gone from, and this is from the American Community Survey, which is part of the US Census, rents that have gone from 700 to 1100, and Solomon mentioned these numbers, that's a 50% increase over the last decade, and almost a 20% increase over the last couple of years. These are really, really tough dynamics given the incomes in your community. And so it's going to put pressure on lots more households. And so If the data continue to follow this path, I think it would be fair to assume that you will see more homelessness in your community. And so focusing on ensuring greater access to housing and more affordable housing will be necessary to hopefully avoid a further growth in the crisis of homelessness in Northwest Arkansas. So one thing that I hear from people is they'll say, Greg, we spent all this money on homelessness and the problem got worse. We should stop spending this money. And I take issue with that logic for two reasons. The first reason I take issue with that is, one is we have a scale problem. Most of the investments that we've made have been inadequate to the scale of the crisis. In LA, they passed a $1.2 billion initiative around homelessness. They're upset that it didn't end homelessness. And when I was there, I said, well, you have a $50 billion problem. You threw $1 billion at it. Now you're frustrated that it didn't end, right? That's just a scale mismatch. The second reason why I don't like that initial argument is that much of the investments that we make in housing and homelessness in the United States are a response to the crisis, meaning we've created a crisis response system, and that is life-saving. I think we have an ethical obligation to create a crisis response system. And I'm grateful for the people who do that good work. But we're fooling ourselves if that alone will end homelessness. It's a little bit, and unfortunately what happens in our society is we then blame the crisis response system and say these people don't know what they're doing, we still have a problem with homelessness. That would be like blaming the emergency room and emergency room doctors for people still breaking their arms. The emergency room exists to care for people when you're injured or when you're ill. It doesn't prevent people from breaking arms. The homeless response system, the crisis response system, is there to care for people when they lose their housing, and I'm glad they're there. But people will continue to enter that system at increasing rates if they don't have access to stable housing. And so we can't blame the crisis response system for mistakes in the housing market that have been decades in the making. We need to intervene upstream and apply far more intensive interventions and capital investments to construct housing that's affordable upstream, such that we don't continue to put so much pressure on Solomon and others who are providing much needed crisis response services to people in need. And obviously, when we want to create more housing, we have to start thinking about some of these local political challenges of land use and changes to regulations to make sure that we can build more housing when needed. So there are all sorts of tensions that complicate this. One of the tensions is, whose responsibility is this? Is this the private sector or the public sector? I would answer my answer to that is probably both. Most of the housing in the United States is built by private market actors, and that's going to need to continue. And so if we have a deficit of housing, we need to create conditions that allow for private developers to build more housing. That alone won't end this, though. There are going to be plenty of people who won't be able to afford that housing. So there is a role for the public sector to ensure that there is subsidy such that people can access housing, or that we're subsidizing housing that will be more affordable for people with lower incomes. And this is when I get accused of being a socialist after being accused of being a corporate shill, when I say that private developers should be able to build. But I'm accused of being a socialist because I'm saying that there are people who are not going to be able to afford housing, and so we need to subsidize it. I don't think that's socialism, it's just math. If we just look at incomes versus housing costs, the math doesn't work. And so we can either put our heads in the sand and just say, well, we'll let the market figure it out. Well, we've done that, and we've seen what the consequences are. So we need to have an adult conversation of how are we going to ensure, given how expensive it is to build housing, how are we going to ensure that more people can access that housing? And that's something that we just haven't done a very good job of, either at the federal, state, or local level in many places around the country to date. So my hope is that we will, in a small way with this book, take some attention off of Joe on the street, not because Joe doesn't deserve dignity, but if we continue to blame Joe for the circumstance in which he finds himself, it absolves us of some sense of responsibility. Okay? If instead when I see Joe, I think about the structural factors that Gregg Colburn, have contributed to that have created the conditions to allow Joe to be on the street, that forces me to look in the mirror and say, well, then what am I going to do? And what are we as a society going to do to change this trajectory? And that's a little scary because, understanding this as a structural issue then demands that we think about structural responses to the problem. And structural responses are challenging because they typically require political will and resources, and it's just a lot easier to blame Joe. The final pushback I'll get is, boy, Joe's a mess. I don't think this housing's going to help Joe. I've had people say those exact words to me, as uncomfortable it is to hear those words. And the reason why I push back on that is I'll say, we have demonstrated in the United States that this does work. leaders of both political parties, because it was good politics, said we don't want to have veterans experiencing homelessness when they return from Iraq and Afghanistan. And many of them had behavioral health challenges, as we all know, addiction, PTSD, et cetera. And so what we did was we prioritized, we put investments towards housing and services. And in the decade of the 2010s, we cut veteran homelessness across the United States by half, which is a remarkable achievement given the housing market dynamics that we experienced during that decade. And so the idea that these programs don't work is patently false. We literally just did it at a federal level. What we haven't done is extended that logic more broadly. And so that success has been in a relatively small subset of the population. And I'm grateful we did it. My dad's a veteran, my grandpa's a veteran, so I have nothing against housing veterans. But I also would really like to see little kids housed and poor people housed and other folks who are experiencing homelessness right now. So we know what works. What we haven't done is extended that logic. And in the absence of doing so, I fear that our communities will continue to face challenges related to homelessness. And so my hope is for your community that you will learn from the mistakes that we made on the coast and not repeat them, such that you'll have kind of a brighter future going forward as your community continues to grow and prosper, and hopefully creating housing access for everyone who wants to enjoy that part of the country. So thanks so much for having me. I look forward to your comments and questions, and wish you well in your work in Northwest Arkansas.
Thank you, Greg. You can't hear it, but there's a virtual round of applause.
I appreciate that. I appreciate that.
The many people joining us on the webinar. I want to invite anyone that's listening to post a question in the Q&A section of the Zoom call. I will ask one or two questions while you get your questions in, and then we will forward your questions to Greg. Well, Greg, my first question is, your presentation really makes us think hard about root causes and not just those individual vulnerabilities. The musical chairs example is so illustrative. There are people who have individual vulnerabilities that are going to be hit harder when there's not enough housing for everyone, but fundamentally the issue is there are not enough chairs, there are not enough homes. My question is, as you do presentations around the country, do you think there's a shift going on among decision makers that understands the root causes better and is beginning to take seriously ways to address homelessness at the root?
I have been really encouraged. I've probably given 150 of these talks around the United States, many of them in person, and so I've had a chance to spend time. I've spent a lot of time in city council chambers with city councils wrestling with these issues, and I would say absolutely. And you could either take this skeptically or optimistically. You could argue that the attention is now being driven just because the crisis is so great that they can't ignore it anymore. And I'll take it. If that's ultimately what gets people's attention, so be it. I would prefer that it not require a crisis to get that attention, but I'm certainly seeing it. I'm seeing it across the political spectrum. We've seen it in the presidential election this fall. What we're seeing from governors and presidential candidates is people talking about housing. This didn't happen in 2016. It didn't happen in 2012. It didn't happen in 2008. And so that's a good thing. And so there certainly still is a divide in terms of understanding causes. There are certainly folks who are very treatment focused and said, you clean up and we'll give you housing. That's been demonstrated not to work. It doesn't stop some people from arguing that. But I've seen a huge change over the last 7 or 8 years across the nation in terms of receptivity to this argument and in the need to prioritize housing investments. And so I'm encouraged by that. We have a long way to go, but we're making progress. I do believe that.
That's encouraging to hear. I want to lift up a question from one of the attendees. They said, I work for city government and it feels like developers can produce high quality housing, but they're more focused on the bottom line. So the new housing we're getting is lower quality, in my opinion. There's also a mental block against multifamily or attached single family dwellings, even though single family subdivisions are inherently unsustainable. And the question I have is, how do we incentivize developers to actually build the type of housing the community needs instead of just what makes the most money?
Yep, great question. So there's kind of two questions there. There's one is, how do we motivate the private market to do what we want them to do? And then second, how do we think about the regulatory framework in terms of the types of housing? So first of all, in terms of motivating private developers to build what we need, I spend a lot of time with developers. There are certainly incentives that the local government can provide to stimulate production in certain areas. We have a multifamily tax exemption program in the city of Seattle that I've spent some time researching. And what that is we're going to waive property taxes for X number of years if you build multifamily housing and have a certain portion of those units be affordable. And what we've seen is people did build. And so if you're seeing housing that is single family in nature and you want more multifamily, then potentially what incentive might you be able to provide such that that housing becomes more affordable, or excuse me, more profitable for that developer to build? And you could use tax exemptions to do that. That's a carrot. There are also sticks in the sense that you can just say, hey, if you're going to build it all, you have to do some of these things. And so what we'll see is jurisdictions have a blend of carrots and sticks. I tend to think that the carrots work a little bit better. Not to say that I'm opposed to sticks, but a stick-only policy, I just don't think is very productive. And that's frustrating because ultimately, yes, I would like to have much more public housing. I would. I just don't know that that's politically feasible right now. And so what we need to do is get on board, work in partnership with our developers and say, boy, this is the kind of housing we need. What type of incentives could we provide to make sure that that happens? And there might be some affordability requirements that then come with those incentives. From a land use standpoint, that is a huge impediment. Your community, I know, has these challenges. Mine does. Seattle, even though it's booming and it's a big city, we're still zoned 70 to 75% single family. So we are not allowed to build multifamily housing on the vast majority of parcels in Seattle. If you combine that with a tech boom, you get a real big problem. And so I think the local politics around this are essential. We have to start having adult conversations about the exclusionary nature of our land use. We need to legalize duplexes and attached single family dwellings and multifamily housing to recognize that if we're going to continue to accommodate the growth that you see in your region, it's not going to happen by just building single family housing. Doesn't mean that single family housing is evil. I live in a single family home, right? But the entire community can't be structured in that way. And that's not the right kind of housing for everyone. So, and that's tough because a lot of people don't want their neighborhoods to change and these become sticky issues. But my hometown of Minneapolis, Minnesota, they eliminated single family zoning throughout the entire city. It's now legal to build 3 or 4 units on every single parcel in the city. I think that's really important land use change. And it also then creates an environment where we say, hey, Minneapolis is a great place. Let's create more options for more people to live here, to enjoy the community, the good schools, et cetera. And so it can be a win-win. I think we can frame these changes positively as opposed to a zero-sum game that if we allow multifamily housing, the neighborhood's going to go to hell, which unfortunately is the narrative that we hear a lot of times at these meetings at 7 p.m. on Tuesday night when people come to talk about new housing development. When people ask me, like, what can I do to make a difference? I'll say one of the most valuable things you can do is to show up at Tuesday night when we're talking about a new multifamily development and say, I think we need more housing in our community, because there are going to be a bunch of people who show up. The research shows that it'll be a lot of people who show up and say, I don't want it. So if you can show up and give the counterpoint, that's a huge impact. It doesn't, it costs you a night, costs you your Tuesday night, but it can have a huge impact for your community.
Thank you for that. And as I scan several questions from attendees, I hear questions mentioning things like tax rebates, about zoning reform for how land is zoned in a city. If I can combine some of those questions together, just as a reminder, your research makes the case that the best explanation of why the homelessness rate varies so drastically city to city is that homelessness spikes in cities where the market has a low vacancy rate and high rents for the people in that market. So could you share a little bit about what are the cities doing where the homelessness rate is lower? What are those cities doing that creates conditions that begin to address the shortage of affordable homes? Is it zoning reform? Is it tax rebates? You mentioned carrots and sticks. What are some ideas from successful cities that we could borrow and use here in Northwest Arkansas?
Sure, great question. Well, one of the interesting things here is if we look at the Sunbelt cities that in the decade of the 2010s built a lot of housing, they had more elastic housing supply. What that shows is more housing supply helps, right? It keeps vacancies higher and it keeps a lid on rents. The way that many of those communities accomplished that goal was largely through sprawl. And so I'm a little reluctant to say, let's just take the Texas playbook and apply that throughout the United States, because there are consequences with that approach. There are obviously environmental stewardship challenges of continuing to build single family homes farther and farther away, and people having hour commutes in cars. And when we think about our planet, that is probably not the best urban planning. But what the data does show is that if you have more units, it helps. It helps. And so I am not an advocate of just saying, let's take the Texas playbook and apply it throughout the United States. What I am an advocate for is let's take the learnings from that, which is more housing helps, and apply that maybe in a slightly different way. So what I would say is let's create that housing capacity, but not through sprawl, but through density. And that will require some land use changes. It will require going up rather than out. And it doesn't mean turning Northwest Arkansas into Midtown Manhattan, right? This can be gentle density that's still charming, that's 2 or 3 units on a lot. It doesn't need to be high rises, but even with those modest changes, you can accommodate a lot more people. And we can do that without having to go to the outskirts. And there's still gonna be plenty of people who live in single family homes, and that's great. But if it's in Fayetteville, and which is a charming town, I've been there, university town, you can create some additional density in Fayetteville, create far more capacity for housing, not change the character of the neighborhood in meaningful ways, and not force people to live an hour away. And so I think that's really important to try to think about what should we take away and what should we learn from those cases. They aren't perfect cases, but there are important learnings. What I can say, and what you can learn from the coastal cities, is if you continue to boom and you don't change your land use and you don't create housing, this problem is going to get worse. I feel very confident in saying that because we just have so many examples of where that has been the case. And so fortunately, you're at the early stages. It may not feel early to you, but relative to the coast you are, where you can change the trajectory of this. And so I think quickly having conversations around land use planning, what regulations we need, what regulations we don't need. Parking is a big one. When Minneapolis changed their land use, scholars have said that the changes that they made to parking minimums was potentially even more important than land use changes because it allows us to create more housing. When Minneapolis changed their zoning, they didn't change the floor area requirements or the height limitations. And so it really restricted what people could build. So what they realize is we have to have a package of regulatory reforms at the same time to make sure that we can create this gentle density that we need. So there are a lot of things that can be done, that should be done. I think the other thing from a community perspective is being really clear, and I like when politicians articulate this, which is when we have job growth, that's a good thing. But we also need to pair job growth with housing growth. And when you have those things in alignment, and it doesn't mean that the public sector is going to build all that housing, but what we say is if Tesla is going to come in and build a battery plant and it's 10,000 new jobs, let's make sure, let's articulate a community goal that we're going to have another 6,000 or 7,000 housing units to make sure that we stay in balance. And then we're working with the development community, we're working with planners to make sure we have the conditions to do that. Because if you keep hiring and you keep hiring, you keep importing people who are highly paid, it's just not going to work. And that's what Seattle has done. So that would be my long-winded rambling response to a good question.
Well, that's great. I think a lot of people living in Bentonville and Benton County know how many people are moving to Benton County because of Walmart, because of Tyson, because of J.B. Hunt. And then down in Washington County or in Fayetteville specifically, the growth of the university. And so there's thousands of new people. We love that growth. But then if there's not a commensurate growth in housing, we'll see the stresses that you're identifying.
That's right.
Can I ask your opinion on Airbnbs and VRBOs? Do you have an opinion on how regulating Airbnbs, which sometimes take units off of the rental market in order to serve as tourists, how those kind of regulations could help address this problem?
Yeah, it's a great question. This is probably one of the most common questions I get around the country. And my answer to the question is it depends. Actually, I teach at the University of Washington. And so one of the jokes that I tell my students in the first day of class is I say, the answer to all good questions is it depends. And usually by like halfway through the quarter, then I'll ask a question and they'll say it depends, and we all laugh, and it's pretty funny. This is one where the answer is it depends. It depends. What is the impact of Airbnb? It depends. I would say that in a lot of communities, we are using Airbnb and VRBO as a scapegoat. In Seattle, people say, well, if we didn't have Airbnb, we wouldn't have a problem. I say that is absolutely false. We created this problem. Is Airbnb and VRBO exacerbating a problem in Seattle? Very possibly. And might it have a modest impact? But generally speaking, our problem in Seattle is a massive, massive supply-demand imbalance in housing. If you go to Bend, Oregon, or Sun Valley, Idaho, or maybe even Northwest Arkansas, which are becoming more tourism driven, there the story is different. You know, it depends. And so there, Airbnb has a huge impact because there have been so many units as a percentage of the housing stock, so many units taken out of circulation because of short-term rentals. And that's a place where it's central to the conversation. And those are places where I think regulating and understanding the impacts are important. And as your community, as Northwest Arkansas, becomes a destination for tourism, you really need to keep your eye on the ball, because if that scarce rental housing is being converted to short-term rentals for people who are enjoying the tourism opportunities in your region, it's a problem. And so I would say communities of your size, it's more of an issue than it is in Seattle, because it's a relatively small part of the story and we've got much bigger issues to deal with. And so I do think having those conversations, and there are plenty of examples of communities your size that have started to tackle this. And so there is a playbook out there for you to follow in terms of, you know, people have a right to do what they want with their properties, but once that becomes, you know, has a significant impact, then maybe some regulatory steps need to be taken. And I think that's probably where your community is.
Thank you for that. As I read through a couple more questions from the audience, I'd like to ask you to say a little more about the public sector role, especially in cities. Some of the things you've mentioned are what cities can do to create conditions where developers build.
Yep.
And in ways that are environmentally responsible, and that you mentioned. We also have questions about, are there incentives that cities can provide? There's a question bringing up how important case management and rental assistance is when supporting people that are getting rehoused, having experienced homelessness. And one person says we have to shift toward caring about people over profits. That's kind of some typical language around thinking about what are the public responsibilities if we fund libraries together and community colleges and nonprofit hospitals. Can you say a little more about what public sector actions could help address this crisis?
Well, I think it's really important. I actually just got back from Washington, D.C. I had the privilege of spending Monday and Tuesday at HUD, U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, with the Secretary of HUD and senior staff at HUD. They brought in housing researchers from around the country to talk about the next generation of housing policy. And what we talked about in that meeting, and I was very clear, was we have a federal housing policy that serves 1 in 4 to 1 in 5 people who are eligible for housing support at the federal level. That leaves 4 out of 5 people who are eligible, who are poor, not getting anything from DC. That then pushes those issues down to the state of Arkansas and counties and cities. And that puts a lot of pressure on local government. And unfortunately, I don't know that that's going to change anytime soon. So it really does elevate and highlight the urgency of the issue for local government. I think states and localities are going to need to step up, because we're not going to get help from DC, which obviously has a far deeper pocket than state and local government. And so that's a challenge. But it doesn't mean that you still can't make progress. I do really think that having more resources around housing and services will pay off, because right now we're paying a lot of money, but it's just disguised in a lot of different systems. So when people come back to me and say, Greg, I don't think local government can afford these interventions because housing and services is expensive, I'll say, you're right, it is. Housing and services is expensive. But you know what else is really expensive? Untreated homelessness. Because these people are going to the emergency room for basic medical care. They're interacting with the criminal justice system, streets and sanitation costs, police and fire. All of these costs through various local government systems are burdened significantly by homelessness. And so when we think about this more holistically, it's There's no free lunch, but the investments from the public sector locally on housing and services will alleviate all these other costs and these other um, municipal services. And so we have to think about both the costs we're incurring in addition to the cost of the interventions. And so, and I just don't know that we're going to get there without some public support there. I think we absolutely need that. And I think local governments need to be making the case about the impact on the community if we don't make those investments. And I understand budgets are tight and this is tough work. And so I'm not suggesting that this is easy, but it is absolutely an argument we need to make because not making those investments is going to be challenging. And like the one commenter said, like there are people who've been on the street for 2 years and just getting them in a unit is not going to be sufficient. They are going to need more robust services and those cost money. And if we want people to be successful and sustainable, this veterans example is a prime example. We need to have those wraparound services. The other thing that's really important is the longer we leave people on the streets, the more services they're going to need when we get them into housing. And so immediately we have to think about more intense services, but in the long run, let's make sure that people aren't spending years on the street such that they don't need these intensive services. And the whole thing is virtuous. It either goes virtuous up or virtuous down. And unfortunately, we're kind of in a downward virtuous cycle, which is we leave people on the streets, they become have much more acute behavioral health challenges. We get them into housing and they need lots more services, which costs more money. And then we have less money for housing and we just keep going down, down, down. We have to disrupt that and start moving in the other direction.
Thank you. One commenter is asking about the dollar amount that a community needs to allocate towards addressing the housing situations. So could you comment on what processes communities or cities are using to quantify the dollar amount of their housing crisis?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's a hard question to answer. To give you, I've actually attempted twice to come up with a kind of strategic plan for Seattle and the state of Washington, and I quit because there were so many assumptions I had to make to come up with like what the dollar sum is actually needed. But in terms of steps that you could take locally, I think the first thing that you need to have is sort of a housing needs analysis. And I would assume your local planning organization has some sense of a housing needs assessment. The first element of that is to take a look at where you are right now and what is your current supply and is there a deficit? And if you have this much deficit of housing, then starting to think about the population growth in your counties going forward, what are the ongoing housing needs? And so you have a current deficit plus ongoing needs. That's the total housing you're going to need. Then start to think about what percentage of that housing should just be private market development and then people can just afford that. And then what percentage of that housing needs to be subsidized? And what are the federal or what are the public resources that would be needed to create that subsidy and to create that affordability? And so then you can start to kind of slowly build into what these numbers might look like over a 10-year period. And the reality is those are going to be big numbers because when you start talking about thousands of units of housing, those are big numbers. Those are big numbers. But it doesn't have to be built all today. It can be built over the next decade. And if you have a plan and some resources over the next decade to really create more housing, that's a good thing. And then you can think about your homeless response system, what the costs are that. And hopefully then what you'll see is we still might have some high intensity people that we need to serve, but the number's a lot lower, right? The people who are serving coffee at the Starbucks are not living in their car because we have adequate affordable housing. Once you take care of that problem, then we can deal with the really high acuity people. They're great people who do this work. I just got back from Europe, was at the European Homelessness Conference. Countries in Scandinavia have homelessness, but it's far lower than the United States because they have affordable housing. The people who slip through the cracks there are really high acuity people. And so ultimately their homeless response system is focused on these really high acuity cases, and that's what they do. And then the provision of income supports and housing takes care of the vast majority of people. So their homeless system isn't fighting the fight that we are, which is trying to create housing and serving people. They're just serving people who have really significant needs. And those people exist in Norway and they exist in Arkansas and they exist in Washington. Let's care for them. We have an obligation to do so. We shouldn't also have the homeless response system trying to figure out how to create all this housing.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. That's a little larger than the homeless response system. Speaking as
Totally.
someone who works in that system, it's a
Exactly.
bigger. Okay. I think we're moving toward maybe our final question or two. A couple commenters are asking about, do you have analytics that are local for us around Bentonville, for example? What are the trends there? What are the patterns in Northwest Arkansas? And then also thinking about communities that are close to our size, about 500,000 people in our metro area. Are there communities of that size that are really are being effective in coordinating their approach to solving homelessness?
Yeah, so I did look at your data. I included Washington County in the slide deck, and I didn't look at Benton, but I think the trends are pretty similar there. And I did look at the homelessness numbers also, and Solomon provided a preview of those at the beginning of the conversation. Certainly what we've seen in your homelessness numbers is, comparing to, let's say, 2018, 2019. Solomon, you can correct me on this, but I think you were kind of in the 300s at that point, and now you're into the 400s. And so, it's going in the wrong direction. It's certainly more people, and as Solomon mentioned, that's probably an undercount. It's not a coincidence that we're also seeing that happen at the same time that you're seeing rents going, increasing at a pretty rapid rate. So I look at the statistics in every community that I visit, and when I see something like this, I'll just say, yep. And not to minimize it, but what I'm seeing is this makes perfect sense. It's perfectly consistent with what I would expect to see, which is rents growth going up, homelessness going up, and vacancy rates going down. Unfortunate, but totally predictable and consistent with what we're seeing elsewhere. What communities are doing good stuff? I was really, I've been in Kentucky a couple times. Their governor actually stood up and made a commitment at the state level to pair housing growth with job growth, which was a really powerful statement from the governor. And so I do think that there are, and Kentucky is probably a similar type state in the sense that there are localized pockets of job growth because of new solar plants or new solar facilities that are bringing population growth to communities that haven't had a lot of population growth in the past. So they're really wrestling with how do we ramp up this housing production pretty quickly. So Louisville, I think, has done some really good stuff. They have thoughtful people there who are wrestling with that. State of Kentucky people. Kansas, I've been there 3 times. I think Wichita has done some really cool things. And so these are probably communities that are not dissimilar from yours. They have a good economic base and they're thriving. This is not places that are dying. Industrial decline type places. They're mid-sized places that are growing. And so I think there are some good examples out there for you to follow. And if you do, want connections, I'd be happy to make some introductions to other communities that have been wrestling with these things.
That's excellent. Excellent. Gregg, I just want to say thank you for your research. Thank you for helping us upgrade our explanations instead of just thinking about individuals and issues like poverty or addiction or, climate, but rather helping us hone in on the home part of homelessness. There is a shortage of homes in Northwest Arkansas and around the country as your research helps us think about the connection between a shortage of homes and the homelessness rates we experience. So thank you for your research. Thank you for your time. And I want to hand it back to Isabel to wrap us up today. Thank you.
Thank you, Solomon. Thank you. Just again to reiterate, thank you, Gregg and Solomon, for joining us today and leading this very important discussion. I think for us, we discussed the lack of housing on all levels, but it's really poignant to see that it really does affect homelessness in a very real manner, and we can't expect our services to solve the housing problem we have in our region. So thank you again for everybody who joined us. We really appreciate it. Like we mentioned, this recording will be on our website hopefully by Monday, and then we'll send out the recording by email as well. And please answer our survey so we can continue to bring speakers from across the nation. Thank you again, and I'll see you guys soon, hopefully. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.